The summer sun hung heavy over the wide plains of New Mexico, where the land stretched out like an endless sea of gold and dust. The air shimmered with heat, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the low hum of cicadas hiding in the brush. In those days, before the towns had proper roads or rail lines, life moved slow and rough. Folks lived by their hands, by their horses, and by the mercy of the land. Out here, far from any law or preacher, a man's word was worth more than paper, and a woman's courage was often all she had to keep herself alive. It was near the edge of a small, half-forgotten settlement, a place with only a saloon, a blacksmith and a few wooden shacks where the story began. People called it Dry Creek, though it had been years since a real creek had run through it. Dust was what filled its veins now. Cowboys stopped there for whiskey, drifters for shelter, and the rest just tried to make it through another day without losing hope or water. On one of those blistering afternoons, a lone rider moved across the prairie, his hat pulled low and shirt soaked with sweat. His horse was tired, its sides coated with dust, but the man didn't seem to mind the heat or the long miles. He had the kind of calm that came from years of quiet living, herding cattle, fixing fences, and sleeping under the open sky. Folks in Dry Creek knew him only as a cowboy who didn't talk much and never stayed long. He came and went like the wind, working where needed, never asking for more than a warm meal and a night's rest. That day, he wasn't headed for town. He was following the trail down by the canyon rim, where the land dropped into a mess of red rock and thorny brush. It was a lonely place, but sometimes the cattle wandered that way, and he figured to bring a few back before nightfall. The sun was sinking low when he noticed something strange, birds circling above a patch of mesquite not far from the trail. His brow furrowed as he slowed the horse and leaned forward, scanning the ground. At first it looked like a bundle of torn cloth tangled in the grass, but as he came closer, the shape moved, and he saw it was a person. A woman lay there, half covered in dust, her dark hair fanned out across the dirt. She wore a buckskin dress, torn and stained, and her skin had the warm copper tone of the Apache tribes that roamed these parts. One of her legs was twisted oddly beneath her, and he saw blood around her ankle. The cowboy jumped down and hurried to her side, brushing away the dirt from her face. Her breathing was shallow and sweat glistened on her brow. The bite was clear now, 2 puncture marks near the calf already swollen and darkening. He knew that look, rattlesnake. For a moment he just knelt there staring at her face. She was young, maybe 20 at most, and her clothes and the beads around her neck showed she wasn't from any nearby village. There were old stories about Apaches raiding ranches or fighting settlers, but those were tales told around fires, usually by men who'd never met one. This woman looked far from dangerous. She looked half dead. He pulled his canteen from the saddle and poured water over the wound, trying to wash away the dust. Her eyelids fluttered, and she whispered something faint, words in Apache he couldn't understand. He leaned closer, trying to catch the sound, but she winced and her breathing hitched. The poison was working fast. The cowboy looked around. No town for miles, no doctor, no chance of help before dark. Out here, when a rattler bit, a person didn't have long. He glanced back at her leg, swollen now and turning a sickly color. He had one choice, and he knew it wasn't much of one. "Hold on," he said quietly, though he knew she probably couldn't hear him. "Ain't gonna let you die out here." He cut a small line above the bite with his knife, steady and careful, the way his old trail boss had once shown him. Then he leaned down and did the only thing that might save her. He drew out the poison the way old cowhands used to, spitting it out into the dust. It wasn't the sort of act a man bragged about. It wasn't noble or clean. It was survival. When he finished, he bound the wound with a strip of his shirt and gave her a little water. Her breathing steadied, but she didn't wake. The sun dipped behind the canyon wall and the light turned red as blood. He knew he couldn't leave her there for the coyotes or the cold. So he lifted her gently, feeling how light she was, and laid her across his horse. He started for Dry Creek as night began to fall, the stars just starting to glimmer over the horizon. Every few minutes he looked back to see if she was still breathing. Her lips moved once, whispering something he couldn't catch. Maybe a prayer, maybe a name. He didn't know which, but it made him wonder who she was and what had brought her so far from her people. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the lanterns were lit in the saloon windows. A few men loitered outside, and when they saw the cowboy carrying a half-conscious Apache woman, their talk turned into a low murmur. Suspicion spread quick in a place like Dry Creek. "Where'd you find her?" one man called, stepping forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard gone gray from dust and whiskey. "Ain't safe bringing her in here. You know what she is." The cowboy's eyes stayed steady. She's hurt. Snakebite. Don't matter, another voice said from the porch. Those folks don't mix with ours. Best leave her out where she belongs. The cowboy didn't answer. He just shifted his grip and carried her past them, heading toward the blacksmith shed, the only place with clean water and firelight. The crowd didn't follow, but their stares burned into his back. He laid her on a blanket, checked her wound again, and gave her another sip of water. The swelling was worse, but she was still breathing. Outside, he could hear the wind picking up, whistling through the cracks of the old wooden walls. It was the kind of sound that made a man feel small and alone, even if he'd lived out there his whole life. He sat beside her, staring at the flicker of the firelight across her face. After a long while, she stirred. Her eyes opened, dark and sharp despite the pain. She looked at him, confused, trying to make sense of where she was. Her lips trembled as she spoke in broken English, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You save me?" He nodded once. Tried to. Her gaze drifted to her leg, then back to him. Something unreadable passed through her eyes. Fear, maybe gratitude, maybe both. Why, she asked. He didn't have an answer ready. He wasn't sure himself. Maybe it was just instinct, or maybe something about seeing her there alone in the dust had stirred something in him. Something decent that the hard years hadn't managed to kill. Before he could speak, there was a knock at the door. The cowboy's hand went to his revolver out of habit. A familiar voice came from outside, the gray-bearded man from earlier. "You best open up," the man said. "Town ain't too happy about you bringing her here. Sheriff's on his way." The cowboy stood, the firelight throwing his shadow long across the wall. He looked down at the Apache woman, her face pale but her eyes alive. Outside, the murmur of boots on dirt was growing louder. She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. "They come shot for me?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. The sound of horses filled the street now, and the sheriff's voice called from outside. "Open the door, cowboy. We need to talk." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He looked once more at the woman he'd just saved, the weight of choice heavy on him. Outside, the night grew still, except for the creak of saddle leather and the slow, steady ticking of boots in the dust. And somewhere in that silence, under the dim glow of lantern light, the cowboy had to decide: protect the woman who owed him her life, or hand her over to a town that didn't believe she deserved saving. The door creaked as he stepped closer, and the light flickered across his face, caught between two worlds, one ruled by old prejudice and another by simple, quiet humanity. Then came the sound of a hand striking the door again. "Last chance," the sheriff warned. The cowboy's fingers brushed the handle. His heart thudded once, hard, and before he could decide, the woman whispered something in Apache, a word that made his breath catch. He didn't understand its meaning, but something in her tone said everything. The door began to open. The sheriff's shadow stretched long across the doorway as the cowboy slowly opened it, the hinges groaning in protest. The air outside carried the dry scent of dust and horses, and the faint glow of lanterns flickered against the wooden walls of the blacksmith's shed. 3 men stood there, Sheriff Tate in front, his badge dulled by years of sun, and 2 townsmen behind him, holding rifles that looked too eager for use. Tate's gaze went from the cowboy to the woman lying behind him on the blanket. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed the way a man's do when he's already made up his mind. "You know what you're doing here, son?" he said, voice low and firm. "That's an Apache. You can't just bring her into town like she's one of us. There's folks who won't take kindly to it." The cowboy's voice was quiet but steady. "She's hurt." Rattler bit her. "I wasn't about to leave her to die out there." Tate sighed and pushed his hat back a little. "Ain't saying you meant harm, but you know how things are. People been on edge ever since those raids down south. Some cattle gone missing. Folks don't trust easy anymore." "She wasn't part of that," the cowboy said, his tone firmer now. "She was alone when I found her." The sheriff's eyes softened just enough to show he wasn't blind to reason. He stepped closer, glancing at the woman. Her eyes were open now, watching every move they made. There was fear there, but also something else. A quiet strength that didn't waver even under the glow of lantern light. "Can she talk?" Tate asked. The cowboy looked back at her. "A little English. Not much. Ask her name," the sheriff said. He crouched beside her again. "They want to know who you are." Her lips moved slowly, forming the words with effort. "Tyan," she whispered, voice weak but clear enough. The sheriff nodded once. "All right, Tyan, you're safe for now, but we can't keep her here. Some men are already gathering outside the saloon, talking foolish. I can't promise they'll stay calm if they see her come sunrise. The cowboy looked toward the sound of distant voices carried on the wind. Angry talk, the kind that spreads fast in small places. Then I'll take her out of town. Where to? He shrugged. Back out near the canyon. There's an old line shack I can use. She needs rest more than talk. The sheriff rubbed his chin. You sure about that? Ain't safe out there this time of year. You'll be on your own. Been on my own plenty before, the cowboy said. Tate studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. All right. I'll tell the folks you're riding north, keep low. And if anyone asks, you never came through here. By the time the cowboy saddled up, the moon was high and pale over the plains. He lifted Tyann carefully, her body still weak but warm against him. The men outside didn't speak as he passed, but their stares followed him. Hard, suspicious, unyielding. The saloon doors swung open just as he reached the edge of town, and someone shouted, "That man's taken her out. Let him go or we'll have trouble." He didn't look back. His horse broke into a slow trot, hooves kicking up dust that glimmered in the moonlight. The ride was quiet, only the sound of the saddle leather creaking and the wind whispering through dry grass. Tyann leaned against him, too weak to sit straight, and he could feel the slow rise and fall of her breath. Every so often she murmured in her language, words he couldn't make out but that carried the sound of sorrow. When they reached the line shack, it was nearly dawn. The place was nothing more than a small wooden cabin tucked between rocks and scrub, left from the old cattle days. He laid her down on a cot and started a fire, heating water from his canteen. As the sun crept up, the light fell across her face and he saw she was younger than he'd thought, maybe just a girl in her late teens. Her ankle was swollen but not as bad as before. He cleaned the wound again and gave her a sip of coffee mixed with a little sugar. "Why were you out there?" he asked quietly. "Alone?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then in slow, careful English she said, "I run from camp. Bad men come, not Apache. White men." Her voice trembled on the last words, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Where?" he asked. "North," she said, pointing weakly. "They come with guns." "Take horses, take people." The cowboy frowned. That wasn't a story he could ignore. He'd heard rumors about bands of outlaws posing as soldiers, raiding native camps for supplies, or worse. Out here, far from law, cruelty was easy business. He poured her another cup of water and handed it to her. "You're safe now. Rest." But she shook her head. "They follow. They find." Her words hung heavy in the air. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that no one would come looking for a wounded girl out in the middle of nowhere. But something in her eyes stopped him. There was truth there, sharp and certain. That night, after she finally drifted to sleep, he sat outside the shack, staring at the stars. The land was quiet, the kind of quiet that could turn dangerous without warning. He could feel it, the unease crawling under the calm. He thought about what the sheriff had said, about the fear in town, about the way people turned cold when they didn't understand something. He knew he couldn't stay long. If those men Tyann spoke of were real, they'd come looking, and if the townsfolk caught wind that he'd taken her, they might decide to handle things themselves. By morning, Tyann was awake and stronger. She sat up slowly, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. "You leave?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." She looked toward the horizon. "They come soon." He studied her for a moment. "How do you know?" Her gaze was distant. "Dream. I see fire. I see dust." The cowboy didn't believe in visions, but something in her voice made him uneasy. He went to check his horse, tightening the saddle and scanning the ridge. The air was still, but too still. No wind, no sound of birds. Just silence. Then he saw it. A faint line of dust far off, moving slow but steady across the plain. He squinted, trying to make out shapes. It wasn't cattle. It was riders. He went back inside and grabbed his rifle. Tyann looked up at him, her expression calm despite the fear in her eyes. "They find us," she said softly. He loaded the rifle, checked the window, and said, "Let's hope they don't mean to finish what they started." The minutes crawled by as the riders drew closer. 3, maybe 4 of them. He could see the glint of metal in the sunlight. Whoever they were, they rode like men who knew how to track. When the first one stopped at the base of the hill, the cowboy could see his face. A scarred man with a wide-brimmed hat and a rifle across his chest. The others spread out behind him, scanning the rocks. The cowboy stepped outside, rifle at his side but not raised. "You're a long way from town," he called. The scarred man grinned, his teeth yellow against the dirt on his face. "Ain't looking for town," he said. "Looking for something else. You seen an Apache girl come this way." The cowboy's pulse thudded. "Can't say I have." The man's grin widened. "That so? 'Cause we heard she might have had company. Fella on a bay horse. Quiet type. Sound familiar?" The cowboy didn't move. The men behind the leader started to circle, eyes searching the rocks and shadows. He could feel Tyann watching from the window, could almost sense her breath catch. The scarred man spit into the dirt. "Tell you what," he said, voice lowering. "Ain't no reason to make this hard. You hand her over, we ride out peaceful. You keep her. Well, we'll have to take her ourselves." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his gun, but his stance said enough. "Ain't nobody here but me," he said. For a moment, neither man moved. The sun beat down hard, and the air felt heavy as a storm about to break. Then one of the riders behind the scarred man pointed toward the shack. "There!" he shouted. The scarred man turned his head just as a shadow flickered inside, the shape of Tyann ducking away from the window. The man's grin turned mean. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Guess you ain't much of a liar after all." The cowboy lifted his rifle and the men tensed. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the sound of a gun cocking sharp and cold in the quiet. The scarred man's smile faded. "You sure you want to die for her?" The cowboy's voice was calm, low, like the wind before thunder. "Ain't about wantin'. It's about right." A heartbeat passed. Then another. And in the next instant, the still morning air erupted with the echo of gunfire, rolling across the plains like the start of a storm. The first shot split the morning stillness like lightning over dry land. The cowboy dove behind a stack of firewood as bullets tore through the air, splintering the side of the shack. Tyann dropped to the floor inside, clutching her wounded leg and biting her lip to keep from crying out. The horse outside reared and bolted, its hooves pounding into the dirt as the riders shouted to one another. The smell of gunpowder drifted thick through the air. The cowboy took a slow breath, peering through a gap between the boards. The scarred man was crouched behind a boulder, loading his rifle again. Two others were spreading wide, trying to flank him. He could tell by the way they moved. They weren't just drifters. They were professionals, men who'd hunted before. He fired once, just enough to make them duck, then slid back inside. Tyann's face was pale, her hands shaking as she tried to wrap her leg again. "They come for me," she whispered, voice trembling. "Yeah," he said quietly, checking his bullets. "Looks that way." Her eyes met his, full of fear and something else, guilt. "They kill my people, I run." "They say I belong to them now." He froze, his rifle half raised. "Belong?" She nodded weakly. "They take women. Sell them, not to towns, to camps, far south." The weight of her words sank in. The men outside weren't bounty hunters. They were slavers, the kind that worked the edges of the frontier where no one asked questions. His jaw clenched. He'd heard rumors before, whispers carried from one saloon to the next, but seeing it now, seeing her fear, made it real. A bullet punched through the window, shattering a clay pot on the shelf. Tyann flinched, covering her head. The cowboy crawled across the floor, keeping low. "Stay down," he muttered. "Ain't gonna let them take you." He moved to the other window, fired twice, and saw one of the men fall, his rifle clattering to the rocks. The others ducked behind cover again, shouting curses. The gunfire stopped for a moment, replaced by the sound of wind sweeping across the plain. "Cowboy," the scarred man called out. "You got a good shot, I'll give you that. But you can't hold out forever. We'll wait you out if we have to." The cowboy didn't answer. He reloaded quietly, his mind racing. He had maybe 10 rounds left. If they circled around, he wouldn't stand a chance. Inside, Tyann pushed herself up on one elbow, eyes darting toward the small saddlebag near the door. "They not stop," she said softly. "You leave. Save yourself." He shook his head. "Ain't in me to run." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "You don't know them. They kill easy." "Yeah," he said, checking his rifle. "So do I." Outside, the men had gone quiet. Too quiet. He knew what that meant. They were moving. He grabbed Tyann's arm gently. "Can you stand?" She tried, wincing with pain. "A little." He helped her to her feet and nodded toward the back wall. "There's an old trail down the ridge. Leads to a creek bed. You follow that north, it'll take you toward Dry Creek. Sheriff Tate'll help if you make it that far." She looked up at him, shaking her head. "What about you? I'll buy you some time." Before she could protest, the crack of a rifle echoed again, followed by the sharp whine of a bullet skipping off stone. He pushed her toward the back door, opening it just enough for her to slip through. She hesitated one last moment, her hand brushing his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she was gone, limping into the brush. He turned back toward the front, taking cover by the doorway. The men were closing in now, 2 on the left, 1 swinging around to the right.
He fired again, driving them back. "Don't make this harder than it's gotta be,"
the scarred man yelled. "We just want the girl. She ain't worth dying for." The cowboy leaned out, fired a shot that whistled past the man's hat, and said evenly, "Then you best go home." The scarred man snarled, "Suit yourself." He gave a signal with his hand and the others moved fast, closing in from both sides. Bullets tore through the walls again, the sound deafening. The cowboy fired until his rifle clicked empty, then grabbed his revolver and waited. He didn't have to wait long. One of the men rushed the doorway, gun raised. The cowboy met him head on, slamming into him with his shoulder and knocking him to the ground. They struggled in the dust, fists flying, the man's breath hot and sour. The cowboy swung hard, landing a blow that sent the man's head cracking against the wall. He went limp. Before he could catch his breath, another burst of gunfire ripped through the shack, grazing his arm and burning a line across his sleeve. He dropped behind the table, breathing hard. Blood trickled down his forearm, but he didn't have time to think about it. Outside, he could hear the scarred man cursing, calling for the others to flank again. The cowboy glanced toward the back. Tayen was gone, the brush thick enough to hide her. He hoped she'd made it far enough to stay unseen. Then came the faint sound of hooves, distant but growing. More riders. For a second, he thought it might be the townsman or the sheriff, but as the shapes appeared over the ridge, his heart sank. There were 5 of them, armed and rough-looking, riding with the same purpose as the first group. Reinforcements. The scarred man saw them too and laughed. "Told you, cowboy. You can't fight the whole world for one girl." The cowboy grit his teeth. He'd been in plenty of fights before, but never one that felt this uneven. Still, something inside him, some quiet stubbornness that had carried him through lonely years and long winters, kept him from giving up. The new riders circled the shack, shouting to one another. Dust filled the air, and the sound of their horses thundered like a drumbeat. The cowboy ducked low, heart pounding. Then through the noise came another sound, a gunshot from the ridge. One of the new riders jerked backward and fell from his horse. Another shot followed, and another man tumbled into the dirt. The cowboy froze. That wasn't his doing. Someone else was firing. He peered through the cracks and saw movement on the ridge, men in rough coats holding rifles. At first he thought they were more bandits, but then he saw the silver badge glint in the sunlight. The sheriff. Tate had brought help. The scarred man cursed and turned his rifle toward the ridge, firing wildly. The cowboy took the chance, stepping out and shooting from the doorway. Chaos broke loose. Gunfire echoed across the canyon, horses screamed, men shouted. Dust turned the air thick and gray. When it was over, only the wind was left. The scarred man lay face down in the dirt, his rifle beside him. A few others had ridden off, vanishing into the open land. The cowboy stood in the doorway, chest heaving, smoke rising from the barrel of his revolver. Sheriff Tate rode down slow, his hat low, eyes scanning the scene. "You look like hell," he said. The cowboy managed a tired smile. "Could say the same for your timing." Tate dismounted, stepping over a fallen man. "Heard shots before dawn. Figured you'd find trouble before breakfast." He looked around. "Where's the girl?" The cowboy glanced toward the ridge where she'd gone. "She ran. Headed north like I told her." Tate frowned. "You sure she's all right?" He hesitated. "She's tough. She'll make it." The sheriff nodded slowly. "We'll go after her, make sure she's safe." He looked at the bodies on the ground. "These men, they ain't locals. Looks like that slaver bunch out of Silver Crossing. Been hearing talk about them for months. Guess we know now who's behind those disappearances." The cowboy wiped sweat and blood from his brow. "You think they'll stop?" Tate gave a humorless laugh. "Men like that don't stop easy. But maybe now they'll think twice before crossing these parts again." The sun was higher now, the heat coming fast. The sheriff's men gathered the bodies while the cowboy stood quiet, looking out across the plains. Somewhere out there, Tayen was still moving, following that dry creek bed toward safety, or maybe toward more danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She'd said those men were part of something bigger, and he believed her. There were too many like them scattered across the frontier, men who took what they wanted because nobody stood in their way. Tate clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did right, cowboy. Most wouldn't have lifted a finger for her." He looked at the horizon, squinting into the sun. Sometimes doing right don't come easy, the sheriff nodded. Never does. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint echo of hoofbeats far in the distance. The cowboy turned his head toward the sound, listening. It could have been the wind, or it could have been Tyann, still riding, still running from the ghosts that chased her. Either way, he knew one thing: this land had a long memory, and nothing stayed buried for long. As the sheriff and his men rode off, the cowboy stayed behind for a while, staring at the empty horizon. Somewhere out there, danger still waited, patient and quiet, and though the fight was done for now, he could feel it in his bones. The real trouble hadn't even started yet. The land had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after too much noise. The cowboy stood alone beside the broken shack, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the air. The sheriff and his men had gone north an hour earlier, following the faint tracks Tyann left behind in the dirt. But he stayed behind, restless, uneasy. Something in him wouldn't let it rest. He'd been through enough fights to know when trouble was finished and when it was just beginning, and this didn't feel finished. The wind came down from the canyon, warm and dry, carrying the faint cry of a hawk somewhere above. The cowboy adjusted his hat and looked at the horizon. The light was turning gold again, the long day slipping toward another red evening. He poured the last of his water into his canteen, checked the rifle slung over his shoulder, and started riding north. The horse moved steady beneath him, hooves sinking into the soft sand where Tyann's footprints had faded into dust. He followed the dry creek bed for miles, the landscape rolling into ridges of sandstone and scrub. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows over the land. Every so often he stopped to look for signs: broken branches, disturbed soil, anything that might tell him she was still ahead. Finally, as dusk settled, he found a torn piece of buckskin caught on a mesquite branch. It was hers. He felt a strange pull in his chest. He didn't know why he cared so much. Maybe it was guilt, maybe decency, or maybe something else. Something that didn't need a name. All he knew was he couldn't let her face whatever came next alone. As night fell, he built a small fire under a ledge of rock. The air grew cold fast once the sun was gone, and the sound of coyotes started echoing from the hills. He sat close to the flames, the glow flickering over his face. The silence pressed in around him, heavy with thought. He wondered what kind of life Tyann had before all this. If she had family still alive. If she'd laughed once like other young women before fear took its place. He wondered too about the men who'd hunted her. The sheriff had said they were slavers, part of a larger group. If that was true, they wouldn't stop with a single loss. And somewhere in that quiet dark, his gut told him they were already moving again. By morning, his hunch proved right. As the first light touched the canyon rim, he spotted smoke rising far to the east, a thin gray column twisting into the sky. It wasn't from a campfire. It was too big. He rode hard toward it, the horse pounding through the dust. The closer he got, the worse his gut turned. The smoke was coming from a burned-out wagon. Around it, the sand was torn with hoofprints and tracks, at least a dozen riders. And there, half hidden in the brush, was a piece of the same beaded cloth Tyann had worn around her wrist. He slid from the saddle, crouched low and touched the ground. The tracks were fresh. She'd been here. So had they. He could see drag marks leading toward the canyon. His jaw tightened and he felt that cold, steady anger rise inside. The kind that made a man quiet, not loud. He followed the trail, moving slow and careful now. The canyon narrowed ahead, the walls high and red with morning light. The sound of voices carried faintly through the rocks, men talking, laughing. He dismounted and tied his horse in the shadows, then crept closer on foot. At the bend of the canyon, he saw them. 6 men sat around a small fire near the ruins of an old stone corral. They were rough-looking, the kind who'd lived long without law. One was sharpening a knife, another cleaned his rifle, and near the center, bound at the wrists, was Tyann. She sat still, eyes fixed on the fire, her face streaked with dirt, but calm, too calm. The cowboy stayed hidden behind a rock, studying the scene. They weren't the same men from before, but they carried the same look, the same cruel confidence. He counted them twice, weighing his chances. 6 was too many. He couldn't take them head on. He'd need to wait for the right moment. Then he heard one of them speak. "Boss says we ride out by sundown. Got buyers waiting in Santa Fe. Don't rough her up too much. They pay more when the goods ain't damaged." The words turned his stomach. He felt his grip tighten around the rifle. He waited until the man sharpening the knife stood and wandered toward the horses, leaving the group thinner. The cowboy moved quietly along the rocks, circling behind the camp. His heartbeat slow and steady, his breath shallow. He reached the far edge where the shadows stretched deepest, took aim and fired. The man by the horses dropped instantly. The camp exploded into chaos. The men shouted, diving for their guns. Tayan flinched but stayed low, her hands twisting at the rope around her wrists. The cowboy fired again, taking another down before ducking behind a boulder as bullets cracked past him. Dust flew, rocks shattered. He rolled to the next cover, reloaded and fired toward the man at the fire. The shot missed, but close enough to send him scrambling. "Find him," one yelled. "He's up on the ridge." The cowboy moved fast, keeping low, his boots silent against the sand. He spotted Tayan cutting her bonds on a sharp rock, her hands bleeding but determined. He caught her eye for just a second and motioned toward the canyon mouth. She nodded, barely visible in the flicker of the flames. Then he felt the whistle of a bullet pass so close it burned the air beside his ear. He dropped flat, dirt stinging his face. Another shot hit the rock near his leg. The men were closing in, circling. Tayan broke free and crawled toward the edge of the camp. One of the outlaws saw her and grabbed his revolver, raising it. Before he could fire, the cowboy's rifle barked, and the man went down hard. The others turned, shouting, firing wildly into the dark. The cowboy ducked again, hearing the click of his empty rifle. He drew his revolver and ran low along the ridge, trying to draw their fire away from Tayan. A bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and sharp, but he kept moving. He fired back once, twice, forcing them to take cover. Then, out of nowhere, came a thunder of hooves. The sound filled the canyon like a storm. A moment later, a half-dozen riders appeared from the south, Sheriff Tate and his men. Gunfire roared again, echoing between the canyon walls. The sheriff's men charged in, rifles blazing. One of the outlaws tried to mount up, but Tate's bullet caught him square in the chest. Two others fled on foot, vanishing into the maze of rock and dust. The cowboy stood up, panting, smoke rising around him. The last of the outlaws was running for the far ridge. He aimed, fired, and the man crumpled to the ground. Then it was quiet again. So quiet it hurt. Tayan was still sitting by the fire, trembling, her wrists raw from the rope. The cowboy went to her and knelt beside her. "You all right?" She nodded slowly, though her eyes were distant, lost somewhere far away. "They come again," she said softly. "More men. I hear them talk. Not end yet." He looked at Tate, who was already checking the bodies. The sheriff's face was grim. "She's right," he said after a moment. "I've seen these brands before." He pointed to a mark burned into the side of one of the dead men's rifles, an iron circle with a slash through it. They belonged to a man named Jeb Coulter, run slavers out of the borderlands. Mean, rich, and well protected. If these are his boys, he won't take kindly to losing them. The cowboy felt that same cold weight settle in his gut. "How many's he got?" Tate gave him a hard look. "Too many. They buried the bodies before nightfall, marking the graves with stones. The air smelled of smoke and sage, the stars coming out sharp and cold above them." Tayan sat near the fire again, silent, her hands wrapped in cloth. She hadn't said much since, but her eyes followed every sound, every shadow. When the others turned in, the cowboy stayed awake, sitting on the edge of the camp with his rifle across his knees. Tayan moved closer, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. "Why you help me?" she asked after a while. He stared at the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. "Because no one else would." She was quiet for a long time, then said softly, "He come for me. This Coulter." He looked up at her. "You sure?" "Yes," she whispered. "He take my sister. I see him. Big man, white hat. He never forget what he wants." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He knew that name now, Jeb Coulter. He'd heard it whispered in saloons across the territories. A man with money, influence, and no conscience. If Tayan was right, they were just standing at the edge of something far worse than a simple raid. Far off in the dark, a coyote howled, long and low. The sheriff stirred but didn't wake. The cowboy looked at the horizon where the stars touched the earth and felt the air shift, heavy with the promise of another fight. He knew Coulter would come. Men like him always did. And when he did, there'd be no hiding, no running. It would be blood and dust again. As the fire burned lower, Tayan's voice broke the silence once more. "You think we live?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, so young, so scarred already, and saw in her eyes the same stubborn fire he'd seen in himself years ago. "We'll try," he said finally. "That's all a person can do out here." She nodded, and for a moment, the silence between them felt less like fear and more like understanding. But the peace didn't last. Somewhere out there in the dark, another fire was burning, the one that belonged to Jeb Coulter's men. And before the sun rose again, the land would shake once more with the sound of war. The morning broke red across the horizon, washing the canyon in soft, golden light. The night had been long and restless, filled with the sound of shifting horses and the uneasy quiet of men who knew trouble wasn't done. The cowboy stood at the edge of camp watching the sun climb. He hadn't slept, not really. His mind kept circling back to Tyann's words and the shadow of Jeb Coulter that hung heavy in the air. Somewhere out there the man was coming, and the land itself seemed to know it. By noon, Sheriff Tate had his men packed and ready. They'd found tracks heading east, heavy riders organized. Tyann watched them from the fire, her hands still wrapped in cloth. The bruises on her wrists were fading, but the fear in her eyes hadn't left. The cowboy saddled his horse slowly, glancing at her once before tightening the cinch. "You sure you want to do this?" Tate asked. "You don't owe her any more than what you've already done." The cowboy didn't look up. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But a man can't ride away from something that don't sit right." Tate studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Coulter's smart. Mean too. He won't come at us fast. He'll pick his ground, wait till he's got the edge." "That's fine," the cowboy said. "We'll pick ours first." They rode out that afternoon, heading toward the foothills where the canyons opened into wide plains. Tyann rode behind the cowboy, silent but alert, her eyes scanning the land as though she could already feel the storm coming. The sheriff and his men followed close, rifles across their saddles. Dust rose behind them, hanging in the air like smoke. By sundown, they reached an old abandoned mission sitting lonely at the base of a ridge. The walls were cracked and sun-faded, the roof half caved in, but it was strong enough to hold for a night, and maybe long enough for what was coming. They set up inside, stacking broken furniture into barricades and laying out extra ammunition. The cowboy checked his rifle one last time before sitting by the window, watching the horizon fade to dark. The wind picked up after sunset. The smell of rain drifted in from the east, faint but steady. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Tyann sat near the fire again, tracing small patterns in the dust with her fingers. "You've been quiet," the cowboy said softly. She looked up. "You think they come tonight?" He nodded. "If they're smart, they will. Men like Coulter like to strike when you're tired." She looked toward the window, her voice low. "When it ends, what you do then?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Maybe find somewhere quiet. Maybe start over." "People like you don't start over," she said, almost smiling. "You keep riding," he smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes a man's gotta try."